Hi everybody, this is Dino Chris from Prehistoric Facts, and today this will be an extra episode. And like I said before, it will take place either on Wednesday or Thursday. But even though today is Thursday, so basically I'm going to move on right now. And basically, the topic that we're actually going to be talking about today is feathered dinosaurs. Somebody requested this and basically in the comments section of my YouTube page, and basically I agreed upon it, so I'll actually get to the feathered dinosaurs topic. Now, when we actually are talking about feathers on dinosaurs, it's basically this. For a long time, paleontologists actually thought that dinosaurs were basically just reptiles, like a different kind of race of reptiles, and pretty much, and what a lot of artists depicted dinosaurs, they usually looked at to modern animals for comparisons, and basically they just looked at modern reptiles, basically just modern lizards, like iguanas, monitor lizards, all those kinds of animals that you would actually think that were actually that are classified as reptiles. And basically it wasn't until the late 80s and in the early 90s was when we actually started to see better discoveries of actually dinosaurs having the close resemblance to birds. But also that kind of started with the Archaeopteryx fossil that was discovered in the 1800s, and pretty much scientists didn't even know what to make of it. They didn't know if it was a bird or was it kind of like a reptile that was actually starting to have feathers. And pretty much, this was actually really good evidence for the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was pretty much inspired by the Archaeopteryx fossil. And the Archaeopteryx fossil was a monumental discovery. And pretty much, that actually kind of gave Charles Darwin the idea that birds probably came from a certain type of reptile that actually started to evolve into birds. And then pretty much, that actually started out with dinosaurs, but even though he didn't really know that, he actually just thought like a certain type of reptile actually started to form into birds. He didn't really actually have the idea that dinosaurs actually had this idea. It had that feature. But until the late 80s and the 90s is when we actually start to see fossil discoveries of dinosaurs that have feather impressions in the fossils that they actually found. And especially the discoveries in Liaoning, China, where you have volcanic ash deposits of basically has beautifully preserved animals that you actually can find. You can find fish, you can find crustaceans, and not sea snails, but snails, and other kinds of things, like some mammals. But even though the better discoveries were actually small dinosaurs. And then basically, it was when Dr. John Ostrom, who was a paleontologist that has been around for a long time, but he's not around today, but even though he's a legend in terms of paleontology, it's because he was the one that actually promoted the hypothesis that dinosaurs did evolve into birds. And a lot of paleontologists were a little skeptical about this. They actually were thinking, were dinosaurs really birds, or were they still reptiles? But basically, it was basically in the late 90s and into the 2000s, that's when we actually started to realize that dinosaurs were kind of like their own thing. It was basically like they were in between reptiles and birds. They do have reptilian features from their ancestors, but even though they actually were starting to develop newer features that actually were going to be in birds, like especially with the theropod dinosaurs. The theropod dinosaurs are pretty much the dinosaurs that you're actually gonna really gonna look at. They have much more close resemblance to birds, especially with how they stand on their hind legs, the erect stance on their hind legs, the back legs, and basically they were pretty much walking with their legs almost underneath their body. And that actually shows that these animals were pretty agile, and they actually kind of use speed for their hunting methods. And also another feature is hollow bones. Almost every theropod dinosaur actually has hollow bones. And that is a really good characteristic from birds. And you would think that that hollow bones were actually evolved for flight. That's not really necessarily the case. Hollow bones are actually really good to actually lighten the weight of the body of the animal, especially that you need to actually have a lighter skeleton, so that way you can be faster, you can breathe better, and also you actually be a more efficient runner. And also the lungs. The lungs are actually going to be very important, especially that birds have air sacs, and dinosaurs that are really closely related to birds, basically the Coelurosaurians, or the Coelurosaurids, they are actually the ones that actually are more closely related to birds. And that includes tyrannosaurs, compsognathids, therizinosaurs, troodontids, dromaeosaurs, and then basically the Archaeopteryx, Archaeopteryxids, and the Oviraptorids, all those kinds of dinosaurs. And then pretty much they kind of started to evolve into the avian dinosaurs, and avian type of dinosaurs, which are flying dinosaurs, which basically today are birds, and basically birds today are classified as avian dinosaurs. And basically the dinosaurs that pretty much were discovered with feathers, especially from Liaoning, China. And basically here are two dinosaurs that actually are pretty much considered to have feathers. On my right hand right here is actually the dinosaur called Dilong or Dilong, depends on how you pronounce it. And this is an early tyrannosaurid, and basically it was actually found with filament type, kind of like hairy types of filaments on the legs and the arms and also parts of the back. It actually shows that possibly it did have feathers. Now, a dinosaur this size, basically being 5 to 6 feet long, pretty much 3 feet tall, probably this was actually for insulation. So, but also males would probably use them for display. So possibly a dual type of thing, where basically it was for warmth and also for display. And the dinosaur right here in my left hand, this one is actually called Guanlong, and this is another early tyrannosaurid, and basically it has been found with hairy filaments in the rock that actually consist of what might be feathers, and basically it would probably be the same thing like Dilong, which is basically for insulation and also for display. And probably males would actually have a larger crest, and this is a very distinct feature in early tyrannosaurids, is basically they have a crest on top of their head, and that would actually suggest that these dinosaurs were probably using these crests for display. Males probably had larger ones, females probably had smaller ones, and pretty much actually were for display. But even though those were not the only dinosaurs that were actually have feathers, the other dinosaurs were probably the therizinosaurids. Now, here's a model of Therizinosaurus. But even though there's no direct evidence to support the idea that Therizinosaurids did have feathers, but even though a close relative of it called Caudipteryx probably did have feathers, and basically, since it's almost a close close relative of Therizinosaurids, it probably was feathered, and probably Therizinosaurids were probably feathered as well. And also, Therizinosaurs do actually have the characteristics of birds. Small head, pretty much, but even though they were becoming herbivores, and basically, they still had some of the same features of like some of their ancestors of theropods, basically. The big feet, but even though they were starting to develop that fourth toe that they would use for extra weight support. But even though the distinct feature of Therizinosaurs is their arms and their claws, they got the big, they pretty much have the longest claws of any dinosaurs, and then pretty much they probably use them for grasping branches, and pretty much possibly for defensive weapons. And so males would probably be more brightly colored, and the females would probably be nearly dull color. But also the more famous dinosaurs to actually that were pretty much covered in feathers a little bit more, and that would actually be the dromaeosaurs and the troodontids. Now here, this is a model of Utahraptor. Now I believe Utahraptor probably had the least amount of feathers on the dromaeosaurs, due to the fact that it's the largest dromaeosaur, and basically when you're pretty much over 6 feet tall, and then pretty much between 20 and 25 feet long, you don't really need to have that many feathers, especially that you're hunting a little bit more bigger game. Now, I do believe that Utahraptor probably did have feathers like on parts of, like basically part of the tail, some aligned along its back, probably some on the arms, and a little bit on the head. I would say they probably didn't have feathers that were covering their belly, not too much in the legs, but even though they probably did actually have really good uses for those feathers, basically for display, not necessarily for flight, but even though they're feathers that are almost ready to be evolved for flight. And so dromaeosaurs were actually the dinosaurs that will become birds at some point. And so these kinds of dinosaurs were probably the ones that almost nearly acted like birds, but even though not entirely. So these dinosaurs were pretty much probably the more famous dinosaurs that probably would have been feathered. Now, why is it that and pretty much the assumption for a lot of people, especially paleontology fan clubs and dinosaur fan clubs, basically when they actually saw Jurassic World, some of them were disappointed on the fact that there were no feathers on some of the dinosaurs, like on Tyrannosaurus Rex or the Velociraptors. Basically, it's just because the Jurassic Park fan base pretty much said, no, don't put feathers on some of the dinosaurs, because they are basically fans of the movie franchise, not really entirely for paleontology reasons or anything like that. It's because they just rather see the dinosaurs that are actually that they're used to in the Jurassic Park franchise. And I mean, I didn't mind Jurassic World with the dinosaurs that didn't have feathers, but even though I would have loved to see the fact that maybe they could actually have feathers, especially in the second Jurassic World sequel that'll come out in 2017 or 2018, and I would hope that things would change a little bit. And so, now, were all dinosaurs covered in feathers? Not entirely. Some of the dinosaurs that I consider to not have feathers are the sauropods, the stegosaurs, the ankylosaurs, and I would think some hadrosaurs as well, even the prosauropods, and some of the earlier dinosaurs like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus, and possibly Coelophysis. Now, I think those dinosaurs probably did not have feathers. Now, I do believe some of the allosaurids and the carcharodontosaurids possibly didn't have feathers as well, because considering that these dinosaurs are kind of the early type of dinosaurs, they really didn't have all those types of features that would probably consider them to have feathers. They probably had a very flexible type of skin, kind of like what you see in some birds without feathers, just because they got more of a very flexible skin, kind of like a bumpy type of skin. Not necessarily scales, but probably kind of like beady, kind of like beads type of feeling. But even though it's very flexible, and pretty much they actually were able to move around pretty well. And so, considering that sauropods, they were too big to have feathers, so they and that is not really a good idea when if you're gonna have feathers. And basically, feathers would probably be more on the legs instead of all over the body. Now, there are some herbivores that did actually have feathers, possibly the hadrosaurs and even the ceratopsians. The ceratopsians are being considered to have like a quill-like type of feathers, kind of like what you see sometimes on an ostrich. They have these like quills that are sticking out on the neck, but also cassowaries kind of have that as well. They kind of have like quill-like feathers, very primitive feathers. And what feathers actually kind of started out as basically the same stuff that is basically made of hair and your fingernails is keratin. And pretty much they started, and as some dinosaurs actually started to actually have these types of quill-like appendages, they kind of actually started to actually branch out and started to actually have like the connecting parts to actually have the feathers to be connected. Like when you break up like an actual bird feather, and basically you just like pull apart some of the branches of the feathers, you would see that they split apart. But then when you actually kind of like slide your finger basically through the feather from bottom to top, it comes back together. It's because basically it has those kind of like these hooks that actually kind of connect to each branch. And so feathers are usually pretty good for insulation, especially for the hatchlings, because basically they need a little insulation so that way they don't get too cold, and pretty much it's a good way to know that the parents are going to identify them very easily. And also a really good use for feathers is for display. Is with color. You can use color to actually attract a mate, and that's pretty much what male birds do most of the time, is they entice a mate by their colors. And another way is for flight, but even though it's very tricky though, because you see that actually would come later in the Mesozoic. But even though Archaeopteryx is pretty much one that is probably considered to be a gliding flight, not powered flight. Some of the dinosaurs that actually kind of were able to fly were basically gliders. They glided, not really powered flight. Kind of like what Microraptor. Microraptor did not use powered flight. It actually just glided. It glided from tree to tree. It did not need to actually flap its arms and its legs to use for powered flight. They probably would have never done that. It's because especially they didn't have the muscles necessary to do that. And so feathers are pretty important. Feathers can be important in some ways, but there's also but even though feathers is still really debatable of how they evolved. We don't even know where they began. We don't even know which dinosaurs actually did start out with feathers, because that's always a debate. It's still going to continue in the future. how did feathers evolve, where did they start, and pretty much which dinosaurs actually were the ones that actually were the first feathered dinosaurs. And so it would actually have to come down of basically learning the ancestry of Archaeopteryx. What is its ancestor, and pretty much was that ancestor covered in feathers. And feathered dinosaurs, I would say less than 50% of dinosaurs were feathered. Others, not so much. Like I said, sauropods, stegosaurs, and the ankylosaurs did not have feathers. There's no evidence to support that. I'd say theropods, like say the tyrannosaurs, compsognathids, oviraptorids, therizinosaurs, troodontids, and dromaeosaurs, and even the avian dinosaurs had feathers. Just not like, I don't think allosaurids probably had that many. Ceratosaurs probably didn't have that many. And also carcharodontosaurids probably never had feathers. But even though it's still debatable, but even though if you guys actually have an opinion about which dinosaurs probably had feathers, let me know in the comments section from this video. But even though that's it for now, now this Saturday we'll be an answering questions episode. So if you got a question about dinosaurs or any other prehistoric life, feel free to email me at dinocris71@gmail.com, or always go on the Facebook page, Prehistoric Facts with Dino Chris. Like the page, you can actually post your questions in the comment section on any Facebook post. But remember, keep your questions short and to the point. You can also follow me on Twitter at CSGRALL. That's my Twitter page. I post pretty cool stuff on there. And also take care of the people around you. And also for you younger people out there, make sure to listen to your parents, your teachers, and your guardians. Those are the best motivation you can have for good education. It's very important to have a good education. So with a good education, you get a good job in the future. Alright, that's it for now, and I'll see you guys this Saturday.